a fortress that kings feared, warriors who turned their own executions into legends, a code so brutal, one mistake meant death. They were called the Jomsvikings, and they might be the greatest con job in history. The Jomsvikings were supposed to be the apex predators of the Viking Age, elite mercenaries operating from a fortress called Jomsborg on the Baltic coast, somewhere around modern-day Poland. Their warrior code was insane. No women in the fortress, no showing fear in battle, ever. All treasure divided equally. If you broke the rules, you were expelled or killed. They fought in the biggest battles of the era, toppled kings, conquered England. And when they were captured and lined up for execution, they faced death like it was a joke, laughing, trash-talking their executioners, competing to see who could die with the most style. But here's the problem. When modern historians went looking for proof, contemporary records, physical evidence, anything written while these guys were actually alive, they found almost nothing. So what's real? Were the Jomsvikings the ultimate Viking special forces, or just medieval fake news? We're about to find out. And the answer is way more complicated than you think.
First, let's talk about what the legends claim. Around 960 AD, a fortress rises on the southern Baltic coast, Jomsborg. According to the sagas written 200 years later, this place was a military marvel. Stone towers with catapults, an artificial harbour that could supposedly hold 360 warships, and a massive iron gate sealing the entrance. Inside lived an all-male warrior brotherhood. No families, no distractions. Pure warfare. To join, you had to be between 18 and 50, and you had to prove yourself in combat, usually by dueling an existing member. One exception, a 12-year-old named Vagn Åkesson, who allegedly beat the chieftain Sigvaldi in a fight and earned his spot. The code was absolute. Never show fear, never run from a fair fight, defend your brothers to the death. Every piece of loot from a raid brought back and split equally among everyone. No exceptions. The most famous story comes from the Battle of Hjörungavágr in 986. The Jomsvikings invaded Norway and got demolished, but what happened after the battle is what made them immortal. The captured warriors were lined up for execution. One by one, they walked up to the chopping block, and instead of begging or breaking down, they turned it into theatre. One guy asked his executioner to hold his hair back so it wouldn't get bloody. Another made jokes about what he'd tell Odin in Valhalla. They were competing to see who could make their death the most memorable. That's not just courage, that's psychological warfare even in defeat. But there's a massive problem with this story.
These sagas were written in the 1200s, over 200 years after the Jomsvikings supposedly existed. That's the equivalent of someone today writing a detailed eyewitness account of the Napoleonic Wars based purely on oral tradition. By the 1200s, Iceland was Christianized and losing its independence. The old Viking world was dead. So what did the saga writers do? They looked back and created what they thought was the perfect warrior society. And here's where it gets sketchy. That famous Jomsviking code, the monastic structure, the strict rules, the communal property, it's almost identical to the codes of the Knights Templar and other Christian military orders that were dominating Europe when these sagas were written. The saga authors were basically writing medieval fan fiction, projecting their own time's military ideals onto the Viking past. They created what a perfect pagan warrior order should look like, not what actually existed. So it's all fake, right? Just good storytelling. Not exactly, because in 2023, archaeologists found something. The legendary Jomsborg has been linked to a place called Wolin, an island at the mouth of the Oder River in Poland. And Wolin was definitely real. Excavations show a major urban centre from the late 900s and early 1000s. Wooden streets in a grid pattern, fortifications, blacksmith workshops, amber working. An 11th century chronicler called it one of the greatest cities of Europe. But here's the twist. It wasn't a pure Viking military base, it was a cosmopolitan trading hub, filled with Slavs, Scandinavians, Germans. Think medieval New York, not Fort Bragg. So where's the legendary fortress? In 2023, Polish archaeologist Dr. Wojciech Filipowiak announced he'd located it. On a promontory called Hangman's Hill near Wolin, his team found charred remains of a 10th century wooden rampart and a pier, a fortified citadel attached to, but separate from, the main trading town. Filipowiak says he's 80% certain this is the historical Jomsborg. So here's what probably happened. There really was a fortified garrison at Wolin, run by Scandinavian warriors who worked as mercenaries. Over centuries of retellings, that garrison got upgraded in the stories. The catapults, the iron gates, the harbour for hundreds of ships. All exaggerations to make the tale more impressive. The fortress existed, the legend around it got inflated. But what about the warriors themselves? Did the Jomsvikings actually fight in the legendary battles the sagas describe? This is where we get our smoking gun, because we have one historically verified Jomsviking we can track, Thorkell the Tall. Thorkell shows up in the sagas as a Jomsviking commander, but unlike the mythical figures, we can actually follow his career through contemporary sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In 1009, Thorkell invaded southern England with a Danish army. For 3 years they tore through the countryside. They besieged London, they sacked Canterbury and captured the archbishop, murdering him in a drunken feast when he refused to let his people pay the ransom. Then Thorkell did something wild. He switched sides and started working for the English king as a mercenary, defending England against other Viking raiders. Then he switched again, joining Danish Prince Knut in his conquest of England. When Knut won, Thorkell became Earl of East Anglia, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. This is what a real Jomsviking looked like. Not a noble warrior bound by honor and brotherhood, but a military contractor, a warlord leading a private army who switched sides based on who paid better and where the opportunities were. The historical Jomsvikings weren't a monastic order. They were a mercenary company. Elite, yes, but motivated by power, money, and political advantage. And honestly, that makes them more interesting. The historical Jomsborg was destroyed in 1043 by King Magnus the Good of Norway. He couldn't allow an independent military power in his territory that might work for his enemies, so he sailed to Wolin with an army and burned it down. With their base gone, the Jomsvikings scattered. As an organization, they were finished. But the legend was just warming up. Today, the Jomsvikings are everywhere. They're in Vinland Saga. They're a playable faction in Crusader Kings and Saga. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you recruit your own Jomsviking crew. There's even an international Viking reenactment group called the Jomsvikings, who work as stunt performers and historical consultants on major productions. The name Jomsviking has become shorthand for elite warriors with their own code. The myth became more powerful than the reality ever was. So were the Jomsvikings real? Yes, there were Scandinavian mercenaries operating from Wolin. They fought in major battles. They helped conquer England. They were formidable. But the legendary brotherhood with its impregnable fortress and death-defying code, that's literature. The real Jomsvikings were military entrepreneurs, playing geopolitics at the highest level. The saga writers turned them into mythical heroes because that's what their audience wanted. Maybe we still want that too. Sometimes the legend is more useful than the truth. If you're into real history behind the myths, subscribe. We've got more coming.